Hi, my name is Steve Chang. I'm with Living Hope Community Church and Solo Network, and I'm here with
Ken Shigamatsu. It's good to be with you, Steve.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, I know it's great because we've talked to each other on Zoom and things of that nature, but really it's to sit down and talk. For those of you who may not know, probably not a lot, but Ken is an author as well as a pastor, and his latest book is Now I Become Myself, right? And I've been enjoying it. It's a tremendous book.
Thank you, Steve.
Hey, tell us a little bit about your background. I know you have a kind of a unique history.
Yeah, well, I was born in Tokyo, and when I was 2 years old, our family moved briefly to New York City, then to England for 5 years, moved to Vancouver, Canada when I was 8, did my undergraduate studies just outside of Chicago, then returned to Tokyo for a couple of years to work in the corporate world, and eventually lived in Boston to go to seminary. Briefly lived in Orange County here to help start a new church, and then headed to Vancouver where I'm pastoring now.
Okay. Now, I've heard you say that you are not really of any culture per se. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, the context for that understanding came when someone came to our church who was wanting to do some writing about it, and this person is from the United States and looked around and said, I've never seen a church this diverse in the States, so what's the key? What was your strategy? And I said, well, we really had no strategy. It was once almost all white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, people of European descent, and we've become more diverse. There wasn't a deliberate strategy to get there. And then this person asked me some questions about my background, and I described how I'd lived in many different parts of the world.
Right.
And he looked at me and said, where do you feel at home? And I said, well, I don't really feel at home anywhere. And then he said, the author said, I think this is what you're trying to do. Because you don't feel at home anywhere, you're trying to set a table where everyone from anywhere, especially those who don't feel at home anywhere, feel welcomed and loved. And so I thought, yeah, that's probably true. I don't feel especially at home anywhere, whether it's Vancouver or Tokyo when I'm back to visit. I may look Japanese, but people can tell that I'm really not Japanese. And so, yeah, in a sense that's been hard, but in a way it's been a gift because I think it has helped me to create a space of welcome for others.
I loved kind of what you were saying. You're trying to create a home for people who don't feel at home anywhere, right? And there are those who may be native to Canada or wherever, but even in their home, they don't feel at home. And you're trying to create a place for them.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Let me ask you something, Ken. I was reading your book and a couple of your other works as well. You are really like reflective, and you think about the inner soul a lot, and you talk and think. You're like a Douglas Willard.
Thank you.
When you are writing a work like this, for example, this drive for perfection and the shame that comes of not being perfect. So it's not only people who are inadequate, but people who are adequate, feeling shame for that. Are you writing from your Japanese heritage perspective or the Western perspective?
I think that I'm blending a little bit of both. By temperament, I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, so I'm an achiever type. I tend to define my value based on what I do, how well I perform. But I think that my Japanese heritage also affects me because at some level I'm concerned not only about how well I do, but how I'm perceived, how I'm seen by the community. And so I think that can also foster shame and a sense of not being quite enough.
When you look at Asian Americans or Asian Canadians, do they struggle with both a desire for achievement and also a desire to be seen and honored by their family and others? Is that like a double whammy?
I think it is a double whammy. So Asians, in many cases, tend to be naturally driven. They want to accomplish things, but not necessarily just for themselves, but so that they can honor their families and be respected in their communities. And so I think that shame is especially perilous for those of us from Asian ancestries.
And how does that play itself out as a pastor or a church leader?
Yeah, I feel that, while as pastors we're called to serve the community and the glory of God, sometimes, and this isn't true just of Asian pastors, but we can be driven to succeed to validate ourselves. So, for example, when I first came to this church in Vancouver that I now pastor called 10th Church, the church had cycled through 20 pastors in 20 years prior to my coming. And the secretary walked into my office one day and reminded me of that fact. This is when I was a new pastor. And she also pointed out the church had gone from 1,000 back in its heyday in the 1950s to 100 and something. And she looked at me and said, "Ken, if the ship sinks now," meaning the church, "everyone will blame you because you were the last captain at the helm." I think she was trying to motivate me to work harder, but I just felt really depressed and deflated. But there was also a part of me that didn't want to fail and that was driven to succeed so as to avoid shame and a feeling that I had let the church down somehow. And perhaps other pastors' experiences are not quite as dramatic, but many of us feel driven to achieve not just for the glory of God or for the good of the community, but so that we can feel better about ourselves.
And to bring honor to their family.
And to bring honor to our families.
And not shame them.
Exactly.
Do you think that's, and you write about a lot of inner struggles or inner wars that we have, the dark side of our, of what we do, etc. When you see Asian Canadians or Asian Americans, you start with shame and the drive for perfection. Would that be one of the biggest things that we wrestle with, or are there other things also that emerges to the top three or so?
In terms of the dark side?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that the desire to do work really well can be a good thing, but when it becomes a perfectionism that's self-absorbed and is concerned about how we're seen, then it becomes a dark thing. I think another related dark side to ministry leadership is overworking. So I came across a blog a little while ago written by a pastor of Caucasian background of race, and he was describing why he was leaving the pastoral ministry. He was a pastor in Illinois, I can't quite recall his name, but he said that as a pastor, you're expected to be like a master communicator and preacher, a gifted MC, a CEO type, the person who directs HR, a counselor, a fundraiser, and a paragon of virtues.
Right.
And so he's
and a best-selling author too. Yeah.
Maybe if you write as well. And he just felt it was just too much pressure, and he felt he was inadequately compensated financially, and so he was just moving on to something else. And so pastors face a unique set of demands which can lead us to exhaustion. And as I write about, one of the antidotes is to have a Sabbath rhythm.
Right.
So a day of rest where we delight in God, where we rejoice in His gifts, in the most important people in our lives, and in life itself. And so that can be an antidote. But for those of us who tend to be workaholics, that also requires faith, because our work is never done. And so we trust that God will continue to, quote, run the world even while we're resting, and that takes trust.
So imagine you're sitting with someone, a pastor of a church that was once 1,000. He went in, now it's at 150. And after 2 years, he's grown it to 50 people. And he's about throwing in the towel, right? He's discouraged, etc. What would you say to him or her?
Yeah, and that was somewhat of my experience when I went to 10th. I think the board was hoping that I would, quote, turn things around. They compared me to a well-known Canadian hockey player named Bobby Orr, who years ago played for the Boston Bruins. But I was coming into 10th feeling very broken. My fiance and I had just broken up. It was a very difficult time in my personal life. I was feeling down and depressed and inadequate. And the church leadership felt that under my pastoral guidance that the church would grow, but it actually shrunk initially during my beginning time there. And there were times when I felt, the church would be better off with some other pastor, and I actually had another pastor in mind. And what kept me there was the clear sense of call that I had initially to the church. This may sound a little bit strange, but I was not sure whether I was being called back to the corporate world or to pursue a vocation in pastoral ministry. So I spent a week fasting and praying. I got real hungry on day 5, so I ended up breaking down and having a salad. But on day 3 of the fast, the words 10th Avenue Alliance Church came clearly to mind. I had no formal connection with the church. And then on day 5, the word senior pastor came to mind. I was in my late 20s. I thought it was odd. And I went to visit the church, and it was a church composed almost entirely of white Anglo-Saxon senior citizens. So I thought the fit isn't right. And the pastor at the time, I didn't tell him I think I'm supposed to have your job, but he said, there are no kids my kids' ages, so I'm thinking about leaving. Why don't you put your name in the hat? And about 8 months later, I was called. And so I look back and I saw that God had clearly guided me to this place. And so I felt, unless God is calling me out, I should stay. And if a person feels as though God has called them into a place, then I would say, stay put, even though the church may be shrinking or you may be facing adversity, until you feel called out, released, or called to something else.
Right. So one of your antidote to whether it be shame or overwork or whatever it may be, burnout, it's not only the rhythm of Sabbath that you talked about, but just even at the front end, to be clear of the calling. Was it a Macedonian call or just a wishful, whatever. And so how you start almost is just as important as how you continue. Right? Okay.
Yeah, I think to have a clear sense of call, and it may not be dramatic, it may not be mystical, but to not let your decision be informed so much by your circumstances or our perceived output, but as best as we can determine, where is God calling me? And sometimes God calls us to a season or a place where we feel like we and the church are flourishing, and at other times he calls us to persevere when things feel discouraging and things aren't growing and things aren't unfolding as we had hoped.
Now let's take another scenario where someone else now at the conference sits down with you. Hey Ken, nice to meet you. I took over a church that used to be 1,000. It was at 150. I went in. It's back up not only to 1,000, but it's now at almost 2,000. We're busting at the seams, and I'm grateful for the Lord. And you're listening to him, but he's asking now an honest question. I don't feel shame. In fact, I'm proud. And I feel like I have a good rhythm going. And when I compare myself to other pastor friends that I have, I'm grateful that God's using me and the such. I'm not discouraged in that way. But he asks you, what are the potential dark side to what's happening in my context?
Yeah, I think that and I think it's somewhat where a pastor feels really successful, and you mentioned comparison, smug, as he or she thinks about themselves in relationship or in comparison to someone else. I think that one of the dangers is that they will become complacent in their relationship with God and feel that the success can be attributed to their gifts and their efforts. And to some extent, God is obviously using the person's gifts. But when we were at a place at a church where it wasn't clear that the ship, meaning as a church institution, would float or not, there was a kind of healthy dependence, even desperation, in a sense. We need the Lord, or else we're done. That was a good place to be, praying, calling on others to pray. And I think that when we stabilized and began to grow and became somewhat, at least from a worldly perspective, more successful, I think the danger was that we would start to coast and rely on our own gifts and laurels as opposed to the Lord. And so that can be, I think, a danger.
And so for the successful pastor, the danger is they become self-reliant. They're no longer, hungry for the Lord, desperate for the Lord.
It can be. It doesn't have to be that way, but it can be.
Well, that's one of the potential dark side to them. Okay. One last question. I can sit with you and talk all the time. I noticed that, when I look at your books, a lot of the people who have endorsed it are people from the majority culture, almost like who's who, Max Lucado and the such, right? So it is that the Western evangelical leadership that is recognizing you and the way that you write, the way that you think, and they're hungry for that. And then you also interface with people who have Asian heritage. When you look at Asian church leaders or people from the Asian background, as well as the Western church background, those who are native or such, what are the subtle differences do you see in terms of the soul struggles that they have? I wonder if that makes sense, what my question is.
Yeah, that's a great question. Haven't thought directly about that, but I think that many of them are similar. People want to embrace the call of God, but also to flourish in their work. But I feel that, as I mentioned earlier, Asians may struggle more with their perception of how they're seen by others because of the heritage of a group-oriented communal society. I think that they're more concerned about how their community sees them and how their family sees them, their parents. And so that adds an added layer of pressure. And so I think that it's especially important for pastors of Asian ancestry, all pastors, all children of God, but especially pastors and leaders of Asian ancestry, to serve out of a posture of knowing that they are the beloved. And so each morning I like to begin the day with a little bit of exercise, typically with a swim, as I did this morning. And then I like to sit in quiet, in silent meditation, and I end my meditation by simply imagining God the Father speaking the words that he spoke over Jesus at his baptism. And I'll say, Ken, as though God were speaking, you are my beloved son, in you I delight. I'll pause and then I'll repeat, Ken, you are my beloved son, in whom I delight. I'll pause, take a breath, and then a third time, Ken, you are my beloved son, in whom I delight. And it's an affirmation of what's true, but as I repeat that and affirm that, it helps me start my day with a sense that I'm loved, regardless of whether I succeed or fail, not because of my production or because of certain gifts I may or may not have, but I'm just loved because I know and serve a God who loves me without condition. And so I think that's a very important place to start, especially for Asian Christian leaders. I think that will mitigate an over self-consciousness about how we're seen and help us relax and live and lead with more joy, freedom, and lightness of being.
Those are great words. For those of us from Asian heritage, our desire and the expectation to honor our parents or our community, and to feel like we've met their expectation. And oftentimes, especially in the immigrant culture, there's a little bit of a cultural and affection disconnect, and so they feel like they need to be good enough, but they don't feel like they've been loved, and so for a lot of the Asian heritage pastors or leaders or just anyone, we have to continue to go back to the love of the Father and center ourselves and be reminded. And that is an unchanging truth, no matter whether your church is 2,000 or 50. And if we're not centered there, we either become too discouraged or too independent, right? Those are great words. Thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks, Steve.